Welcome to Match B2B Insights. I'm Benny Fluman, founder and CEO of Match B2B. Today we're tackling one of the most dangerous myths in MedTech, that FDA approval means you're basically on the way to revenue. You're not. Approval changes legal permission. It does not guarantee commercial readiness.
I'm Brenda, and I'll help guide this one. We're going to stay practical and pretty blunt, because this is where a lot of leadership teams lose time right after what feels like a huge win.
I'm Daniel Weiss. I work on go-to-market systems and revenue infrastructure. And honestly, a lot of medtech companies don't have a sales problem after approval. They have a buyability problem they haven't defined yet.
I'm Brian Newman. I spend a lot of time in the US market, and this shows up all the time. Founders say, "We got approved, now we scale." But the hospital system is basically saying, "Fine, now show me how this gets bought."
Exactly. Clinical validation and commercial adoption are not the same milestone. A product can be safe, effective, impressive, differentiated, and still have no real revenue path. That sounds harsh, but it's true.
So the first misunderstanding is thinking approval solves the market question.
Right. It solves a regulatory question. That matters. But then you enter a different battlefield. Budget ownership, reimbursement logic, committee review, procurement exposure, implementation burden, margin pressure. Different game, different scoreboard.
Sometimes teams move straight from the product works to let's build awareness. More conferences, more outbound, more reps. But if there's no viable payment pathway, all you're doing is increasing noise.
Yeah, and from the field, that noise can look like momentum. Doctors lean in, booth traffic is strong, people want demos, internal introductions happen. But inside the account, nobody has answered the real question. Can this institution actually adopt and pay for it?
That's the anchor for this episode. Approval gets you into the conversation. It does not make you buyable.
Let's define that word clearly, because it's doing a lot of work here. Daniel, what do we mean by buyability?
Buyability is the market's ability to adopt, pay for, and operationalize the product under real conditions. Not theoretical interest, real-world fit. Can the account absorb the cost? Is there a payment structure? Can the workflow handle it? Can the stakeholders justify the change?
Yes, and I'd push it one step further. Buyability is not, does somebody like it? It's, can the system say yes without breaking economics, process, or accountability?
That distinction matters because MedTech teams often confuse three things: interest, demand, and purchase intent. Interest is, this looks valuable. Demand is, we'd like to use something like this. Purchase intent is, we have a path to fund, approve, and implement this. Those are not interchangeable.
And when those get blurred, leadership misreads the market.
Exactly. They see positive signals and assume conversion is coming. But strong products fail all the time when the economics are wrong. If using the product worsens margin per procedure, raises cost per case, or creates operational friction with no clear offset, adoption slows down fast.
This is where founders sometimes get frustrated and say, but clinically this is clearly better. Fine. The market can agree with you and still not buy. Healthcare systems do not reward you for being clinically right if the economic pathway is broken.
And in the US, if the hospital has to absorb the cost because there's no covered pathway, enthusiasm collapses pretty quickly. Not always in the first call, sometimes 3 calls later, but it collapses.
So buyability is really the commercial reality test.
That's exactly it. Not is the product good, but is the market structurally able to buy?
Brian, let's ground this in US hospital reality. What does the decision flow actually look like?
Messier than most founders expect. A physician might introduce the product, but then you usually hit layers: department leadership, finance, procurement, administration, sometimes service line leadership, and very often a value analysis committee, VAC. That committee process alone can take, say, 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer.
And that timing matters because companies often treat the first positive meeting as pipeline advancement. Operationally, it might just mean you've entered internal review.
Right. A hospital is not asking one question. It's asking several. Clinical. Does it improve care? Financial. What happens to margin per case, cost per procedure, throughput, reimbursement exposure? Procurement. What contractual and supplier risk are we taking on? Administration. Is this worth organizational friction?
And budget ownership is not always obvious either, right?
Exactly. Sometimes the department wants it, but the budget sits centrally. Sometimes the department owns part of the spend, but procurement or finance blocks it. Sometimes there's no one eager to own the cost at all. That's a huge red flag.
Healthcare buying is usually consensus-driven and risk-filtered. It's not hero-driven. In software, one strong executive sponsor can move a deal. In MedTech, one strong clinician often cannot.
And approval is constantly filtered through risk and budget before it benefits from clinical enthusiasm. That's why I say the market is not slow in some vague sense. It's structured to slow anything that adds cost, complexity, or uncertainty.
So when a company says, the hospital loved it, the follow-up question should probably be, which part of the hospital?
Yes, because the answer might be the part that can't approve anything.
Let's stay with that, because the physician champion issue is one of the biggest traps. Benny?
A physician champion matters. Let's be clear. They can validate use, create urgency, open doors, influence peers. But they do not usually control reimbursement, procurement exposure, or budget approval. So, physician support creates momentum, not control.
This is where teams over-forecast. They mistake advocacy for buying power. The deal feels alive because the clinician is active. But unless finance and administration are aligned, it's often stalled much earlier than the CRM shows.
I've seen this exact scenario. A physician champion pushed hard internally, ran a pilot, got good clinical feedback, brought in colleagues, even presented the use case upstairs. Looked fantastic from the outside. But finance reviewed the cost per case and basically concluded the hospital would absorb too much margin pressure under the current payment structure. The deal died quietly.
Quietly is important there.
Yeah, nobody says your deal is dead. They say we need more review, or let's revisit next budget cycle, or we're waiting on additional committee input. But inside, it's over unless something changes economically.
Exactly. And leadership reads that as a long sales cycle. Sometimes it's not a long sales cycle. Sometimes it's an unbuyable deal being kept polite.
There's another version too. The champion can get you into a pilot, but not into scale, which means the commercial architecture is missing upstream.
So a better question is not just, do we have a champion? It's, can this champion pull in the people who carry financial and operational risk?
Exactly right. Without that, you don't have an opportunity. You have support.
Let's go straight at reimbursement, but in business terms. Daniel?
Reimbursement is the payment logic behind care delivery. If a hospital uses your product, how does that cost get covered? Through what mechanism? Existing CPT, HCPCS or DRG pathway, covered by Medicare, covered by private payers, or does the hospital absorb the cost itself?
That's the point. If there is no existing CPT or DRG pathway, or if the use case is not covered by Medicare or private payers, the hospital may be forced to eat the cost. And that kills adoption very quickly.
And the distinction between covered and non-covered use cases is everything commercially. Covered means the institution can at least model the economics. Non-covered means you're asking them to take financial pain up front and hope the value somehow compensates later. Most won't.
How should leaders think about Medicare versus private payer realities here?
Carefully. Medicare coverage can shape baseline economics and influence how providers think about viability. Private payer behavior can vary, and that variability adds friction. If coverage is inconsistent, the provider faces uncertainty at the case level, which weakens adoption confidence.
This is why reimbursement is not a technical footnote. It is market structure. It defines whether the product fits the financial operating system of care delivery.
And in the field, when teams say, we have demand, I always ask, from who? A clinician who wants it? Fine. But if the hospital cannot recover the cost under real payer conditions, that is not demand in a commercial sense.
So reimbursement isn't one objection among many. It's shaping the market before the rep even arrives.
Exactly. If insurers don't pay, hospitals usually don't buy. That's not ideology, that's mechanics.
Let's talk messaging. Why does feature-led messaging break down so often in MedTech?
Because product benefits alone do not move economic buyers. Better performance, improved outcomes, advanced technology, fine, but incomplete. The economic buyer is not asking whether the product works. They're asking whether it improves margin per procedure, lowers cost per case, increases throughput, protects revenue, or reduces risk.
Exactly. One product needs multiple value cases, not one generic pitch. For clinicians, the story may begin with outcomes and usability. For finance, it's budget impact and return logic. For procurement, it's supplier risk, implementation burden, and contractual clarity. For committees, it's the integrated case.
This is where a lot of teams show up with one polished deck and hope the room self-sorts. It doesn't. The physician may love slide 6. Finance may reject slide 2. Procurement may still not know what operational burden they're signing up for.
So the story has to change with the stakeholder, but the core economic logic stays consistent.
Right. And that logic has to be specific, not vague efficiency. What kind of efficiency? Fewer complications, faster turnaround, better throughput, lower labor intensity, less waste? If you can't tie the claim to a concrete business effect, it won't survive scrutiny.
And this is where companies sometimes think the market is rejecting the product. No, it may be rejecting the way the product is framed. Elegant messaging can still be commercially weak.
I've heard pitches that were clinically compelling and commercially unusable in the same 10 minutes. Happens all the time.
That's painful, but useful. It means messaging isn't decoration. It's part of the revenue design. This brings us to pipeline. Benny, you're pretty tough on this topic.
Because it matters. Let me make this very concrete. We worked with a MedTech company post-FDA approval. Strong clinical results, strong product. Over 6 months, they ran about 40 meetings across US hospitals. On paper, it looked impressive. Physician interest, demos, internal conversations, even a couple of pilots. The pipeline looked like $3 to $4 million. Actual revenue? Zero. Not because the product failed, because no one had defined the economic path. No clear reimbursement pathway, no identified budget owner, and no defined approval route inside the hospital. So what looked like a pipeline was really just structured interest with no ability to convert. That's the buyability gap.
Conference season is the classic example. Team comes home with 100 badge scans, a bunch of great conversations, maybe 10 physician intros. Everyone feels great. Then you ask, which of these accounts have a covered pathway, a real buyer group, and a chance of moving this fiscal year? Suddenly the room gets quiet.
Dashboards can hide the problem. Open opportunities, demos, pilot discussions, call notes, next steps. It all looks active. But the funnel may be optimized around motion rather than commercial viability.
So what makes a pipeline commercially viable?
A viable pipeline includes economic conditions, clearer reimbursement logic, known stakeholders, identifiable budget ownership, realistic approval path, and evidence the institution can operationalize adoption. Activity without those conditions is not traction.
Exactly. Interest is not buyability. Visibility is not buyability. A lot of MedTech funnels are contaminated from the start because qualification is too clinical and not economic enough.
And because sales cycles can run 6 to 18 months in MedTech, companies can live inside that illusion for a long time. Deals look alive, people reply, internal meetings happen. Then finance or procurement steps in and the opportunity freezes.
So some late-stage deals were never really real.
Correct. They were clinically interested, not commercially viable. Different thing.
Let's go deeper on pilots, because this one feels especially seductive.
It does. A pilot feels like progress. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just expensive exploration. A pilot without predefined success metrics tied to ROI, budget ownership, and a clear post-pilot purchase pathway is not a commercial step. It's a clinical experiment.
And the missing elements are usually obvious in hindsight. What metric are we proving? Margin impact? Cost per case? Throughput? Risk reduction? Who owns the success criteria? And if the pilot succeeds, what exactly happens next?
I'll give you a field-style version. Team gets a pilot in a respected U.S. hospital. Everybody celebrates. 6 months later, the users like it. The physician champion is positive. There's good anecdotal feedback, but no one agreed up front on what constitutes commercial success. No finance owner, no purchase timeline, no committee conversion plan. So the pilot ends and nothing.
That's brutal.
Yeah, because the company funded learning for the hospital and got no buying path in return.
Which is why the better version is very different. A useful pilot answers a commercial question. It proves an economic point under defined conditions. It includes who signs off, what threshold matters, and what purchase mechanism follows if targets are hit.
And ideally, it sits inside a covered, or at least economically plausible pathway. Otherwise, you create the worst result. Yes, it worked clinically, but we still don't know how to pay for it at scale.
So, pilot versus traction. That's another distinction leaders need to police hard.
Absolutely. Pilot is a format. Traction is commercial movement.
Let's shift to segment strategy. Brian, what do we mean by reimbursement-ready segments?
Very simply, segments where the payment pathway is clear enough to support adoption. Not perfect, maybe, but clear enough that the institution can see how using the product fits its economics. Those segments are usually where you get less friction and faster conversion.
And that's why segment selection should start with economic readiness, not just clinical relevance. A use case can be clinically attractive and commercially weak. Strong teams prioritize where reimbursement conditions, stakeholder incentives, and implementation feasibility are more favorable.
This is where a lot of companies overreach. They say, our device can be used across multiple indications, settings, and specialties. May be true, commercially dangerous. Broad stories feel ambitious, but often create diluted execution.
So focus is not a limitation here. It's a way to reduce adoption friction.
Exactly. Start where the market can actually buy. Build proof in segments with clearer payment logic. Then expand. Too many companies try to win a huge category before they've proven one buyable wedge.
And from the outbound side, that changes everything. Your account lists get tighter. You look for signals like covered pathways, institutions known to adopt comparable solutions, service lines under cost pressure, or environments where throughput and workflow improvement actually matter commercially.
It also improves qualification consistency. Reps aren't just chasing logos or titles, they're evaluating whether the economic conditions make adoption plausible.
So reimbursement-ready segmentation is really the first commercial filter.
Yes. Before messaging, before volume, before automation, start with where the market structure gives you a chance.
Let's ground this in timing. Daniel, what should leaders expect from the real MedTech sales cycle?
Longer than they want. Often 6 to 18 months, depending on the setting, the complexity, and the economic clarity. And internal approvals add months. Value analysis committee review, finance review, procurement review, legal, budgeting windows. These are not side events, they are the process.
Even a well-positioned hospital deal can take 6 to 12 months from initial interest to procurement approval, and that's assuming reimbursement is already relatively clear. If it isn't, things slow down further or stop politely.
This is why timing matters as much as messaging. You can have the right message in the wrong budget cycle, with the wrong committee calendar, in an account that cannot absorb change this quarter. Great story, wrong moment.
When companies say, the market needs education, that may be only part of the truth.
Exactly. Sometimes the market understands perfectly well. It just cannot move yet, or cannot move under current economics.
And this is where operational discipline matters. Stage definitions should reflect actual buying events, not seller activity. Had a good demo is not the same as past internal economic review.
I've seen teams forecast deals because a physician said, "We want this in Q3." Meanwhile, the VAC wasn't scheduled, procurement hadn't engaged, and no budget owner had been confirmed. That's not timing risk, that's qualification failure.
So the longer cycle isn't just a patience issue. It's a design issue.
Correct. If you understand the true cycle, you build for it. If you ignore it, you keep mistaking delay for progress.
Let's build the better model. What does a strong economic narrative sound like?
It frames the product in terms of cost, revenue, and risk, not hype, not adjectives. What financial pressure does this reduce? What revenue does it protect? What cost per case does it improve? What throughput does it increase? What operational or procurement risk does it lower?
And again, the story changes by stakeholder. For clinicians, outcomes, usability, workflow fit. For finance, margin impact, budget logic, time to value. For procurement, implementation burden, supplier risk, contract clarity. For committees, how the clinical and economic case hold together.
A practical example. If you're talking to a physician, you might lead with better patient handling and procedural value. If you're with finance, you'd better be ready to discuss cost per procedure, reimbursement implications, and whether this protects or pressures contribution margin. Totally different conversation.
And that means marketing can't just produce one set of materials and call it done.
Exactly. The email to the clinician, the one-pager for administration, the procurement follow-up, the pilot summary, those should not all sound the same.
This is where feature-led messaging fails. It assumes the product story is enough. It isn't. The market buys through stakeholder-specific decision filters. If your narrative ignores those filters, it breaks somewhere inside the account.
And usually not loudly, quietly, which is worse.
Quiet failure seems to be a theme in MedTech go-to-market.
It is. Which is why your narrative has to surface the economics early, not hope they work themselves out later.
All right, let's close by making this usable. Benny, what's the practical framework?
Simple, but not easy. First, define an ICP that includes economic fit, not just clinical relevance. Second, map the stakeholders: clinician, finance, procurement, administration, committee dynamics. Third, evaluate timing. Can this account move under real budget and approval conditions? Fourth, build an economic narrative aligned to each stakeholder. Fifth, make marketing and sales work from the same definition of a real opportunity.
I'd add measurement discipline. Track buying signals, not vanity metrics. Which segments advance faster? Which stakeholders create actual movement? Where do deals stall? What conditions correlate with close probability? That's how you build repeatability.
And from an execution standpoint, stop rewarding activity that ignores buyability. Busy reps, busy dashboards, busy booths, that can still produce weak revenue if the underlying accounts can't buy.
So this is really about aligning marketing, sales, and strategy around real buying signals instead of hopeful ones.
Exactly. Marketing's job is not visibility by itself. Sales' job is not chasing interest by itself. The shared job is to build a revenue pathway.
Before we wrap, one short takeaway from each of you. Daniel?
Map the economic system before you scale the sales system.
Brian?
Physician interest is useful. It is not proof of commercial viability.
Mine is, visibility is not the goal. Relevance is.
And mine is blunt. FDA approval gives you permission to sell. It does not give the market permission to buy. So here's the real question. Is your current pipeline built on accounts that can actually buy under real reimbursement and budget conditions? Or are you still mistaking clinical interest for a revenue pathway?
That's the right place to leave it. Benny, Daniel, Brian, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great conversation. Take care.
This is Match B2B Insights. We'll be back with another practical conversation soon. Bye, everyone.